And we're not helping ourselves any in that by misinforming American public. And one of the things, I'm going to go back to that phone call with Trey Yingst there, because he talked some other things about what President Trump had told him, and pay particular attention here to what the claim is, that that 13 consecutive days of attacks from Central Command, what he claims they produced on Iranian side.
The president also talked about his meeting yesterday with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the Oval Office. He says it was a great meeting, adding he understands now. It appears that the relationship between President Trump and the Israeli Prime Minister is strengthening. And again, the president called that meeting in the Oval great. In terms of possible talks with the Iranian regime, the president says we're going to let them keep talking. Remember, the Iranians came to President Trump after 13 straight days of U.S. bombing against Iran, asking to meet about the Strait of Hormuz and their broader nuclear ambitions. And those talks are taking place as we speak behind the scenes. And then this surprise attack launched against U.S. forces overnight.
Are there talks going on behind the scenes?
No. The Iranians have zero interest in talking to Trump. They will not talk with him. They will not talk with the United States representatives. And this is the problem with the media in the United States. They're all deeply compromised, especially Fox News. So he said, I think, remember, after 30 days of bombing, the Iranians came to. No, there's nothing to remember. This is just a fabrication. The Iranians right now are sitting and waiting for the next round of conflict. If Trump escalates, the Iranians will escalate. If the United States continues with these limited attacks, Iran will carry out limited attacks plus, because the Iranians over the last 13 days have been hitting the Americans harder than the Americans have been hitting Iran. Every night when the Americans would strike, the Iranians would strike back, but they'd add a thing or two to put pressure on Trump. And I think we've seen the results. We've seen how much damage has been done. And the Iranian capabilities this time around have been more impressive even than the 40-day war, and in their precision and the amount of damage that they've done. And I think it's becoming clear that the Iranians are not running out of anything. They have lots of missiles and drones. And it sort of reminds me of back in the day. It's sort of you think it's like 40 years ago, but back in the day when the war in Ukraine began, they kept saying that the Russians are running out of missiles and they're tearing up washing machines and taking out the chips. Well, the Russians are still firing those missiles, and they're not finishing. And it's been the interceptors that have run out, and Zelensky is going around begging for interceptors. So we're seeing the same thing with the United States. They've been bringing in interceptors from across the world, taking it from South Korea, taking it from the Europeans, and the Iranians are just firing away. So the Iranians are not interested. The Iranians are only going to accept the United States carrying out its commitments plus. In other words, Iran is not, the MOU is no longer enough for Iran. Next time around, if there are talks at some point, the Iranians are going to say, first of all, you have to give something up front. We're not going to do it like last time. Second of all, the Iranians are going to add Yemen and the siege. It has to be removed, and something has to be done about Gaza. Now, last time around, Gaza wasn't named, but it was a part of the talks. So was Yemen. But this time around, it's going to be more explicit. And there may be other things too. The Iranians will no longer accept the MOU as it was, nor the implementation of the MOU as it was, because we saw that the United States refrained from carrying out its commitments. It violated all of its commitments, and that is why where we are today.
And on still was point number one on there. You mentioned potentially the adding in of Gaza and specifically Yemen. But what about the existing paragraph 1, which is the Lebanese part? Because in the language, I always thought it stood out to me that it said there has to be an end to the fighting, but it didn't say anything about Israel having to withdraw. Some people were saying later that was a requirement, but it wasn't in the actual language that was signed. Might that change also?
Well, I don't know about I don't know details. I'm just speaking in general terms, obviously, but in the first article, it does say Lebanese sovereignty, and of course, you can't have sovereignty when the foreign occupation exists. I mean, if, let's say, I don't know, Mexico takes New Mexico, and then you speak about American sovereignty, doesn't have meaning unless New Mexico is liberated, or the Mexican government withdraws, or whatever. You get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
By the way, another thing that I should add, and is that, because again, this is something that Fox and other media outlets have been repeatedly saying. They keep repeating that the Iranians, they hit these tankers, and that's what started this round of fighting. And I know that the reality, but and I know your audience is very politically aware, but I just want to point this out for those who may not recall or may not have heard before. This is not how this happened. We had the MOU. The United States began violating every commitment. They were supposed to hand over Iranian stolen assets. They didn't. They were supposed to force the Israelis to respect Lebanese sovereignty and bring an end to the war. They didn't. And the same was true with all fronts, so Gaza and so on. They didn't. They were not supposed to expand the sanctions regime. They did. They were supposed to lift the sanctions on Iranian oil exports. They lifted it and then reversed it after just a few days. Then they went, and this is the key part, of course, they went and opened up this corridor in the Strait of Hormuz. And I know you've discussed this, and I apologize. And then they collaborated with the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Kuwaitis to have ships go through that corridor, despite the fact that in Article 5, the normalization of the Strait of Hormuz during the period where the MOU is being enforced is with the Iranians. So the Americans were violating it, and these countries were collaborating. And Iran kept warning the Americans and these countries, but they ignored Iran. That's when, after a few days, Iran struck 3 of the ships. Many ships passed through. The Iranians kept warning them, and then they struck these ships, 3 ships from these countries that knew what they were doing. Then the United States struck Iran, another violation, and restarted the war. And of course, they reimposed the siege, which is another violation. So the Americans violated every aspect of the deal. But you know what is the most interesting thing? And that is that in the MOU, after 1 month, the strait is supposed to be normalized. If the Americans had just waited for 10 more days or so, I don't know exactly how many days it was, then this would have been over. In other words, the Iranians the passage of ships would have been as easy as it was since before the war. But the Americans had to try to undermine Iran. They had to undermine Iran's authority, and that led to where we are today, where the crisis, the global economic crisis, is growing. So if the Americans had done nothing, they just said, okay, let the Iranians do what they're supposed to do in accordance with Article 5, right now, as you and I are speaking, we would be in month 2. In other words, trade through the strait would be normalized. It would only be limited in that can't go, or U.S. naval ships can't pass through, but everyone else would be moving back and forth. So Trump basically created a crisis for no reason whatsoever, except for the fact that he just wanted to undermine Iran.
Yeah, and how'd that work out for us? Not too good. Let me ask you one other question here, because again, in the context that things are international or interrelated, this also, there seems to be a new front was opened up in this. First of all, the United States and Saudi Arabia attacked some of the PMF units, the Shia-backed units inside part of the Iraqi security forces, which of course made the Iraqi country, and then the presidency, they were really upset about this. We've also seen the Jordanian side had an open letter that said that they want the American forces out. They don't want that to be a target, magnet for targets to be hit to here too. But you said earlier that you thought that this was a big mistake for the U.S. and Saudi Arabia to attack the PMF units. Why do you say that?
Well, first of all, I'd like to point something out. During the period when ISIS had taken huge parts of Syria, and then they invaded Iraq, Iran and Hezbollah sent in troops to help the Iraqis create a force alongside the armed forces to defeat ISIS. that force was the PMF, um, the Popular Mobilization Forces, the Hashid. And when Mosul was liberated, I actually went with them into the city. The Hashid that I was with Hashid there were Christians in them. I actually spent a dinner with one of the Christian leaders of the Hashid in an area around Mosul. I don't remember that part of the country, what it was called, but he was Christian, funded by Iran, supported by Iran. I went with him with two other academics and experts, and we had dinner with him. We spoke. We went through a huge region, which were Hashid, the Sunni popular mobilization, because they were Sunni neighborhoods. The Christian unit was in a Christian area. It wasn't like they were separated. It was just like because they were mixed too. But like in some areas, people are predominantly Shia. There's Christian, so it was predominantly Christian. And by the way, the Yazidis, it was the Iranians who saved the Yazidis and the popular mobilization. So somehow in the Western media, they tried to make this something about the United States out of the world, which was not true. But the point I'm making is that, so this Hashid, this popular mobilization force is for the whole of Iraq. And what the Americans and the Saudis did is that they bombed it. But the reality is that the attacks they bombed it because they said that they had hit Saudi Arabia. But the reality was it was Yemen, both on day one and on day two. It wasn't Iraq. And they went and bombed these units that were a part of the Iraqi armed forces. So, and then the Saudis were dishonest because they said yesterday, meaning not today, but the day before, they said that drones struck Saudi Arabia. There were no strikes on Saudi Arabia yesterday, whether from Yemen or from the Iraqis. But it appears that Saudi Arabia does not want to attribute the strikes to Yemen because they don't know what to do about Yemen. So they try to blame Iraq and take it out on Iraq. But what this has done is that it has caused huge uproar in Iraq. And people are protesting and demanding revenge. And the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, the Iraqi resistance as well, they are saying they're going to get their revenge. So what the Saudis have done, and there have always been sensitivities between Saudi Arabia and Iraq anyway, which is historic. I don't want to get into that. But the point is that the Saudis, they provoked Yemen. Now they've provoked Iraq. I mean, they provoked Yemen by bombing the international airport, foolishly. Now they bombed Iraq with Americans alongside Trump. And Trump is not popular anywhere in this part of the world. So they're seen as bombing alongside Trump, being alongside Israel effectively against the resistance, which is supporting the Palestinians. So in Iraq, they've created outrage. Across the region, people know whose side they are. And now we're just going to get more escalation.
And so I mean, I'm just thinking militarily, the Saudi Arabian was, even with U.S. tanker support and other things that they had since 2015, were never able to defeat the Houthis ever, no matter what they did on the ground, in the air. It didn't make any difference. And they just wore themselves out until they finally just kind of threw up their hands or so. And then now with this war has begun, and going back to the Biden administration, they tried to do some stuff with the Houthis, who were trying to hold shipping in the Red Sea because of what was happening in Gaza, et cetera. Then the Trump administration comes in. They tried. They couldn't do it after about a month. They just threw up their hands and said, yeah, never mind. We're not going to do that. Well, now all of a sudden here we're back engaged again. And why would Saudi Arabia, as best you can understand, why would they want to add another front on their world? I mean, they've already got the issue with Iran. They have the issue with the closure of the Bab al-Mandab, and now then there's kinetic activity there. Why would you want to add another one on the Iranian side or the Iraqi side?
Well, two things. One is that actually the Houthis, as they're called in the West, but who call themselves Ansar Allah, and also they're the Yemeni government too, they are much stronger today than they were when they were fighting the Saudis back then. And the Saudis, as you rightly pointed out, ultimately had to accept a ceasefire because Ansarullah began to become more capable. They began to develop drones and missiles, and they were starting to hit Saudi energy installations, and the Saudis had to give up. And then, of course, as you rightly point out, the United States couldn't defeat them. So what are the Saudis going to do now? And now the Saudis have, and the Americans, they have Iran, they have Yemen, they have Iraq, of course, now. So now they've sort of like stirring up multiple hornets' nests. But then there's another thing, and this is, I think, could be linked to your answer. Dr. Larijani, who is the chair of the Supreme National Security Council, and who the Americans and the Israelis murdered during the 40-day war, he once said in a private conversation, but that person who he spoke with said this in a gathering. He said that, look, I've met many of these leaders because he was the chair of the Supreme National Security Council. He'd go back and forth. The delegations would come from these Arab family regimes in the Persian Gulf and so on. And he said, look, a lot of these people get what I'm saying. They understand what I'm saying. But they are too, this is me paraphrasing. This is not what he said. They're too corrupted by wealth and being bound to the United States to be able to do anything, to be able to change, to be able to think straight, to be able to do the right thing. I think that Mohammed bin Salman is surrounded by yes men. And I don't think that he was brought up to think in a reasonable manner. Remember, this is the guy who kidnapped the Lebanese prime minister and beat him up. This is the guy who went and murdered Jamal Khashoggi, Saudi national, who was close to the Saudi government until he sort of drifted away a bit. He and I used to have debates where he would support the Saudi government and I would criticize the Saudi government. He murdered him in, as we all remember, in Turkey, and he just made his body disappear. And then he went and imposed a siege on Qatar. And then he also carried out this genocidal war on Yemen. So this is not exactly the most sophisticated and thoughtful leader on this planet. And so you just like with Trump, where you and I and others are always wondering, why is he doing this sort of thing? The same is true with him. He's not thinking rationally. And once I've said this in a couple of places, on a couple of different shows. Once when I was younger, like I think 20 years ago, I remember my good friend Alistair Crook, he used to have these conferences, these seminars in Beirut. And about maybe 20 years ago or so, I went to one of his seminars. I was 20 years younger. And he said, we were having coffee, me, him, and maybe a couple of other people. And then he said something about Western policy. And I said, well, Alistair, why is the United States doing this, or why are they doing this? It's not in their interest. And he said to me, Mohammed, your problem is that you think that in the West, the decision-making process is based on reason. I went back to Lebanon a few months later to another one of his conferences, and we're having another conversation, I guess, over coffee, something like what last time. And we were also talking about some other policy. I don't remember what it was. Alistair, being a smart guy, I said, well, Alistair, why are they doing this? This is like not in the interest of the West. And he said, Mohammed, remember what I told you a few months ago? In the West, they don't think based on they don't carry out policy based on rational thinking. It's emotions. Much of it is emotions. So I think that when it comes to Trump, it is that times two. And I think when it's Mohammed bin Salman, it's probably the same thing as Trump. It's not based on rational thought. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here in the first place. We wouldn't have had the 12-day war. We wouldn't have had this 5 months of war, and we wouldn't be seeing the developments over the last few days playing out like they are. And it's really becoming dangerous because now you have conflict in Yemen and Saudi Arabia. Then you have Iraq and Saudi Arabia. Then you have the Iranians and the United States. I mean, it's becoming a multi-front. And then you heard the news about the Iraqi government arresting the Ukrainians. They were Ukrainian cells or Ukrainian-backed cells in Iraq. They were firing drones at different actors. So Iranian supporters of Iran, critics of Iran, different, just trying to create chaos. And so the Iraqi government arrested them, I think, over the past few days. So in this situation where there are so many different actors and there's so much weaponry, and then you have all this oil and gas, all these oil and gas fields, it makes it less, the chances for things getting out of control become, of course, much higher.
Well, and then, of course, now we have to fold into everything you just said the statement by Benjamin Netanyahu after his meeting with President Trump yesterday, whom President Trump this morning said was a great meeting, etc. Netanyahu came into town specifically claiming he had new intelligence that said Pickaxe Mountain is where a new nuclear weapon program was being started, etc. And Trump has to go and take good care of that. What is going to happen to this volatile mix you just so aptly described if the United States actually does, if that's what President Trump chooses to do, to go back to, kick the F out of Iran, so to speak, and he does what Netanyahu wanted to do and hits Pickaxe Mountain? Is that going to draw Israel back into the war? Is that going to make the whole thing go up? What do you think the Iranian reaction might be?
Well, the Iranians are prepared to strike the Israelis, but the Iranians want them to start. And the reason is that the Iranians believe that the situation inside Israel is very bad, and that the divisions are huge, and that there is potential for violence. And so the Iranians just want to sit back and watch. If the Israeli regime strikes Iran will hit back hard, much harder, the Iranians say, than they did during the 40-day war. It'll hit them very hard to make sure Israelis know that Netanyahu made life miserable for them. But if Iran strikes first, then, and again, this is me saying it, I can't speak on behalf of anyone, but then it sort of creates this situation where some people may rally around Netanyahu. And Iran doesn't want that. Iran wants the situation in Israel to get worse, the internal dynamic. So Iran is prepared to hit, but it wants the Israelis to start. But if Trump escalates,
if he hits Pickaxe, what happens?
Yeah, if Trump escalates, the Iranians have said very specifically about this mountain that if the United States strikes it, they will retaliate across the region. And that means striking critical infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Bahrain, like that. This would be sort of like hitting the bridges and hitting the power plants and all that Trump has been planning. So Iran has said that they're going to hit back very hard. Wow. And so any escalation now by the United States, I think, is probably going to lead to the situation that we are all not looking forward to seeing, and that is a global economic meltdown. Because ultimately, and again, you know this better than I, you have guests who are economists, and I'm sort of going out on a limb, but you can manipulate the market for a time, and AI can help you do it and so on. But when suddenly we're close to a crisis, and then people are seeing on television Saudi assets being blown up, Kuwaiti assets being blown up, Qatari asset, that I think is going to cause a panic. And then you're going to see chaos, and you're going to see a collapse. Because I think we're very close. I mean, based on Trump's own assessment 4 weeks away, let's say Trump exaggerates as he always does. When he's not lying, he's exaggerating. Let's say it's 8 weeks, not 4 weeks. We're getting there. It's already 2 weeks. And then when you add the Red Sea, the pace is increasing. So if suddenly we wake up one morning and we're seeing scenes of ruin and devastation on oil installations and gas installations and tankers and all that, I think that means the end. I think that means the global economy will crash.
Has the, as far as you know anyway, has the Iranian regime communicated to these regional GCC countries that says, hey, we don't want to hit your energy infrastructure because it'll set you back many years, et cetera, and cause all this global economic catastrophe and stuff, to include friends of Iran too, like China and India and some other folks that would also pay for that, to say, hey, if you'll just, walk away from the United States, we won't hit you. Is anything like that going on?
All the time. It's been going on for 5 months. All the time. They even send out delegations. They receive delegations. They're in communication through their embassies. But these countries, they began this by betting on the wrong horse. They thought that if Trump attacks, he'll win the war in a couple of days. Remember, they're like, they get their information about Iran from the same sources that Trump does. The Western media, think tanks. Iran is about to fall. It's an unpopular regime. It's about to implode. They're incapable of governing themselves. Just a little push and it's going to collapse. All that nonsense that we've been hearing for the last 47 years. And you recall, I advise people to read a couple of books on Iran, like Going to Tehran by the Leverets, or Alistair Crook's book, Resistance, to get a better understanding of reality instead of this sort of nonsense. But in any case, they get their info, even though they're Iran's neighbors, they get their information from the same Western sources. So they believe the nonsense. So they thought that Trump would wage this war. It'll take a couple of days. The so-called regime would collapse, and they would be in Trump's good books, and they wouldn't have any difficulty. Well, it didn't turn out that way, as we knew it wouldn't, because all that nonsense about Iran was exactly that. It was nonsense. And we saw that through the funerals. We saw that through Iran's military capabilities. But in any case, they bet on the wrong horse, and now they're stuck, or they feel stuck. And these countries they're not sovereign entities. These princes and kings, they're bound to the West. It's the West that keeps them in power. They don't have, Saudi Arabia is a country named after a family, the Saud family. That's not a country where people are going to want to die for. And so you have this family in charge. They don't have popular legitimacy. They don't have any real, civil society in the sense that you or I would understand it. So they're fragile. They're brittle. And so if they turn against the United States, they'll be overthrown by the same people who keep them in power. If they stand up with the United States, we get what we're getting right now.
That's not a good
All
place
they can do is in private beg Trump not to do these things. That's all they can do.